So I think it's just after 6, it's about 3 or 4 minutes after 6. I think I'm going to just get started, and as people can join us, they'll just catch up. Okay. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Kathy Kennedy, and I'm the Senior Manager of Outreach for the Peconic Land Trust, and I welcome you to our ongoing series of Zoom programs. I hope you're doing well, of course, and staying safe and healthy. And from all of us at the Trust, we do wish you the best. We're grateful that you're choosing some time to spend with us tonight. It's been interesting to recreate a lot of our in-person activities as virtual programs, and I do hope that you've been enjoying them. The topics that we've covered so far have included conversations with local farmers, chefs, and producers of specialty items, the importance of native plants in the landscape, the future of horticulture on Long Island, a local artist connection to conservation, as well as how to be tick safe on Long Island. So these are some of the programs we've had. They are all available on our website blog if you are interested in taking a look at them. Tonight, we're excited to introduce you to 3 people as well as our moderator, all of whom share an expertise in our coastline that is working to protect and restore the shorelines that offer habitat to marine animals, as well as protect upland areas and our homes from rising sea level. With the effects of climate change felt all around Long Island, the integrity of our coastlines is critically important. I hope you find this conversation both informative and thought-provoking. Thank you for tuning in, and special thanks to our 3 panelists and our moderator. On a housekeeping note, I just want to let you know that you are muted during the conversation. As I mentioned before, at the end, we will be answering questions. So you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to post questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So a little bit about the Peconic Land Trust. As you may know, the Trust was founded in 1983 with a mission to conserve Long Island's working farms, natural lands, and heritage. And with your help, as well as with the support of thousands of individuals, partner organizations, foundations, community groups, all levels of government, we've been able to accomplish a lot. We've protected over 13,000 acres of land, including thousands of acres of natural lands. So that means wetlands, shorelines, meadows, and woodlands that provide places to explore nature and offer habitat for wildlife and protect our water for drinking, fishing, aquaculture, and recreation. In addition, we've helped conserve over 6,000 acres of farmland on Long Island that's available to farmers growing food and many other agricultural products. Working farms are an important part of our mission, and protecting the land and then helping farmers be as productive and successful as possible remains a high priority for the Trust. We've supported our farmers' efforts to provide local food to our communities through affordable access to land, administering grants and programs that help them grow, and offering educational programs to help maintain their high standards. All of this and more we're able to do because of supporters like you. Thank you. For today's panel, we're so pleased to have Elizabeth Hornstein of the New York State DEC and State Coordinator of the Peconic Estuary Partnership, Steve Schott, Marine Botany Habitat Restoration Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and Matt Swain, the Peconic Land Trust's Director of Stewardship. Our moderator for tonight's program is Dr. Kathleen Fallon, Coastal Processes and Hazards Specialist with New York Sea Grant. Kathleen received her degree in marine sciences from Stony Brook University and conducted her graduate work in geosciences at Florida International University. In her current position with New York Sea Grant as a Coastal Processes and Hazards Specialist, Kathleen works with various stakeholders dealing with issues ranging from flooding to erosion. Before I turn the program over to Kathleen and our panelists, a final reminder on the Q&A. Please use the button at the bottom of the screen to pose questions to the panelists, and we will be turning to those questions at the end of the program and try to get to as many of them as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Fallon with our sincere thanks.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you again for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm excited to moderate this very important discussion and excited to have the expert panelists answer the questions that I have come up for them. Before I get started into the questions, I wanted to start with a quick overview, definition of a living shoreline. So a living shoreline is a shoreline management option that minimizes the impacts on natural habitats while still providing stabilization and risk reduction. They are constructed to mimic and maintain or improve natural features and the coastal processes by utilizing native materials. And the ultimate goal of a living shoreline is to provide risk reduction benefits while also providing ecological benefits and services such as habitat creation and water filtration. And as we go through these questions, the panelists are going to go into further detail on this, expand upon this definition. So I wanted to start with my first question for Matt. How exactly did the Peconic Land Trust acquire the property? I'm speaking of Widow's Hole.
Yeah, well, the acquisition of the property actually dates back to November of 2012. We accepted the property from ExxonMobil. It's a 2.4 acre parcel on the corner of 4th and Clark Streets in Greenport. Previously, this property was owned and operated by ExxonMobil. It was acquired by Mobil Oil in 1924 and operated as a petroleum product storage facility until its closure in the mid-1980s. The facility, you can see in that top left picture, operated with 6 above ground tanks that stored fuel oil, kerosene, and gasoline. All of these products were delivered to the terminal by barge. The wharf, storage tanks, and buildings were removed shortly after operations ceased, and environmental remediation was completed in 2002 by ExxonMobil. At the time of our gift, in order to ensure the protection of the property, a conservation easement was also granted to the town of Southold, with the village of Greenport as a secondary holder of the property. So 2012.
Thanks, Matt. And I wanted to turn to Steve. If you could explain a little bit about how Cornell Cooperative Extension became involved in this project.
So I believe it was around 2015, the land trust had approached my supervisor at the time, Chris Pickrell, who is our wetland specialist, and basically about developing a management plan for the property. Being that it had been a commercial property, there had been a lot of disturbance to it. The upland aspects of the preserve had a lot of invasives. The shoreline had been heavily manipulated, and with the removal of bulkheads and different structures along the shore had really lost its natural characteristics. So Land Trust approached Cornell to see if we could help them develop a management plan that they could use going into the future to kind of remediate the property and bring it back to a more natural state.
Thanks, Steve. And then lastly, Elizabeth, the similar question: how did Peconic Estuary Partnership become involved, and how did this work support PEP's mission and goals?
Yeah, so Peconic Estuary Partnership is a national estuary program that brings together partners from all levels of government and all sectors to work together to protect and restore the Peconic Estuary and the surrounding land area. And we have a management plan that guides our work, and 2 of our primary goals are to restore key habitats for the benefit of wildlife, and also to create resilient coastal communities in the face of climate change. And this Widow's Hole Living Shoreline project really checked both of those boxes, aiming to restore lost salt marsh and also address some of the shoreline erosion issues. So this project was identified as a priority through our Habitat Restoration Committee group, and this project was going to be one of the first living shoreline projects in the estuary, so we were really excited to support it. And we were able to allocate some of our National Estuary Program funds to support the physical construction of the living shoreline.
muted myself. Thank you so much, guys. So moving on from how this project got started and how all of your roles in it, Matt, how does the Peconic Land Trust weigh issues on waterfront properties when you consider them for conservation? And furthermore, why did you choose a living shoreline design for this property?
Well, I'll just start with saying, personally, I've worked on hundreds of projects ranging from aquifer protection to pine forests, dunes, all these different things. What I can tell you is waterfront preservation is not unlike other types of preservation. It basically has to do with the availability, impact, and of course, the funding that's available. But generally, because water preservation is extremely expensive because of development pressures and the like, compared to just your typical farmland, let's say, the least amount of it has probably been done over the years. But whenever we have the opportunity through gift, community fundraising, using state, county, or community preservation funds at the local level, we're pretty much willing to do these projects as they come up. As far as the selection of this property for a living shoreline, because of its dynamic history with ExxonMobil and also the great deal of erosion that it suffered over the years, particularly Steve and I have tracked this since Hurricane Sandy, when pretty much the entire parcel was underwater, and also had a fence around the whole property, and about half of that dropped into the water after Hurricane Sandy. This scenario paired with the fact that the shorelines historically around Greenport Harbor have been hardened structures such as bulkhead, jetties, groins, and the like, we thought it would be a great area to study the impacts of a much softer, more natural approach in the living shoreline.
Great, that's perfect. And it actually leads awesome into my next question for Steve, to kind of talk a little bit more about the design process, what the design is, why you chose the design you did, and how the process of designing it went.
So as Matt said, especially after Sandy, the property really had started to show more and more erosion along the upland edge. The high tide line had really migrated in, upland of where it had traditionally been, even just prior to Sandy. And again, this is a shoreline that had been bulkheaded, most likely backfilled behind that bulkhead, and then was then again disturbed once those bulkheads and the caissons and all the other structures that were there were pulled out. So there was nothing natural left to that shoreline. So what we were looking at was there was definitely a pattern of erosion on the shoreline itself. I could discuss these pictures in a second. They're not directly involved, but these are some of the options we had to deal with. But what we were looking to do was try to rebuild the beach, get a more natural grade to the beach. We were shooting for a 5% grade, and then provide some kind of protective structures to the shoreline that did not involve bulkheading or rock revetments or the like, using as much of the natural materials that we had available to us and natural options. In this case, we decided to use a dune system. There's a rock underlayment, a line of boulders on top of filter cloth underneath the dune that was put in and requested to be included in the plans by New York State DEC to kind of protect that upland edge that had been eroding regularly over the years. Dunes, while excellent protection for shorelines, are kind of meant to be, sacrificial. And that's the way nature had intended them, as long as you don't mess with and manipulate the movement of sand and the natural sand budgets in areas. So even our South Shore beaches, in the wintertime, those dunes really get blasted, and some of them naturally will be able to replenish themselves. Others will need some help, sort of like we had in Hampton Bays over the last couple of years. And we need to bring material in. And in this case, this is what we did at Widow's Hole. We built a coastal dune with a rock toe underneath to try to protect that upland from erosional issues. And then just downshore of that in the intertidal zone between high tide and about mid tide, we started planting smooth cordgrass, which is our local tidal marsh plant. And that band would also help trap any kind of sand trying to move offshore as it grew, as well as when it's fully grown and filled in, will act as a wave baffles. It'll dampen wave energy as it comes into the site. So that's, in that case, that's for a moderate wave exposed shoreline. Now the pictures we have here, the top corner that the pointer is on, this is a project we did at the Shinnecock Nation in Hampton Bays. That project was completed in 2017. We used a very similar kind of idea. In this case, though, the rock, the boulders were put just below mid-tide to act as a wave break, and then we planted the smooth cordgrass in and around the rocks and above them to about the high tide line to establish a vegetative zone that would help with knocking down wave forces as they rolled in on the beach. Some of the other options, the Peconic Estuary program funded a demonstration project in Southold Town with Suffolk County Water Quality Protection Funds to provide a demonstration area to show different techniques that can be used for living shorelines. This is located at our facility at Cedar Beach and Southold, in the creek right behind our facility. We used a low sill bulkhead technique, and we actually, in this case, instead of using pressure treated wood or plastic lumber or milled lumber, we decided to go with a more natural product, and the land trust had dead locust trees at one of their properties that we were able to cut down and utilize to make the sills. That's the top center photo. The bottom left photo is a core logs. They're basically a fiber netting that's filled with coconut fiber. These would be used in more sheltered sites like this creek site where there's not a lot of wave action. They are not as permanent as some of the other options. They tend to break down in 3 to 5 years, but they're more of a short-term stabilization. Next to that is shell bags. These are biodegradable bags that are filled with, in this case, seasoned, what they DEC considers seasoned surf clam shells. These provide more of a hardened structure, and as the bags break down, the shells will actually kind of spread out, but they also provide an attachment point for rib mussels and even oysters that might set on the shell available and could potentially create a reef at the toe of the marsh. And then finally, you're getting into more of a traditional type of hardened structure that would be used. These low rock sills, basically it's a low rock wall at the base of the eroded marsh or shoreline edge to provide some stability and prevent sediments from being washed out and offshore. And then you would plant behind that with the Spartina, the smooth cordgrass, which as it roots and spreads would really cement and hold that sediment. And then another option that we used, and you see more down in the Chesapeake area, is they use these offshore either oyster reefs with basically just piles of shell, or in this case, we used shell bags and then set oysters into those shell bags. This was at Shinnecock as well. And this is would be below low tide. And as the waves come in towards the shore, they would hit this barrier before they even hit the shoreline with the boulders and then the smooth cordgrass. And that provides not only protection for the shoreline from waves, but it also provides filtration as the oysters establish and start to filter feed.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So we talked about the Widow's Hole project, and we talked about the Southold demonstration sites. Elizabeth, can waterfront homeowners around the Peconic Bay consider using these living shoreline techniques for their own properties?
Yes, absolutely. And we hope homeowners will consider using these living shoreline techniques instead of more hardened structures like bulkheads and seawalls. We've seen a large increase in hardened structures over the last couple of decades in response to rising sea levels and more frequent storm events. And unfortunately, these hardened structures can have negative consequences for the environment. And because these structures do disrupt the natural sediment movement patterns, they can actually make erosion issues and flooding worse. And then this puts other properties in the area at risk, and you kind of get this domino effect where you have other property owners putting up these hardened structures to provide protection, and then we end up with entire shorelines that are hardened. And this replacement of natural habitat with hardened structure results in the loss of our coastal habitats like beaches, wetlands, and eelgrass, which obviously has negative impacts for the many wildlife that rely on those habitats, as well as fishing and tourism industries. So living shorelines are really a better alternative. And as Kathleen talked about in the beginning, they provide a number of ecological benefits, like the creation of habitat and improved water quality, while at the same time helping to stabilize the shoreline and decrease wave energy. And they're also often less expensive to install and maintain. So that's a bonus for property owners. And, you know, really one of our goals with the Widow's Hole project, as well as the other demonstration project that Peconic Estuary Partnership is funding and working with Steve and Cornell on that he mentioned, is to use these projects to educate property owners on the benefits of living shorelines over hardened shorelines. And with both of these projects, post-project monitoring is conducting to evaluate the benefits, and we will be sharing those results with the public. And the last thing I want to mention is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation does have a living shoreline guidance document for property owners that are interested in installing living shorelines, that provides details on how to go about designing and constructing these projects and the permitting process. So for any of the waterfront homeowners out there, I would encourage you to check that out.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Matt, can you talk a little bit about what is happening to the Peconic Bay and the Peconic Bay wetlands as the climate has been changing?
Yeah, sure. And Elizabeth touched on a little bit of this, but I assume all the attendees watching this panel are at least aware of the issues, but the most obvious one is that since the temperature is increasing, and most models have it over the next 100 years in this region between 4 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit, this is actually going to rise the sea level in this area locally. Most of the models have it between 7 inches and 1 foot by the 2050s. This is pretty dramatic. And it will also increase the demand for hardened shorelines. But I think one of the things that is happening, and it's pretty obvious over the years, and most people don't really associate this with climate change, is that there's shifts in precipitation patterns, and particularly you get more and more extreme rain and weather events. And what this does is it actually causes a greater runoff of nutrients and other pollutants from the land into the Peconic Bay estuary. And it also does increase the atmospheric deposition of these. But these rising sea levels are expected to result in increasingly frequent inundation of drinking water as well, and septic systems along coastal properties. And this leads to more and more nitrogen and pathogens entering groundwater, surface waters, and eventually the estuary. In turn, what they refer to this as nitrogen loading in the Peconic Estuary. What it does is it results in more and more frequent algal blooms we've seen over the years. We also have reduced water clarity and a general degradation of coastal habitats. The excessive pathogens also lead to more frequent closing of beaches that people go to bathe. It closes shellfish harvesting areas. And also, Steve could probably touch on this, but the herbicides and pesticides increasingly are being linked to the losses of seagrass and other marine habitats. So it's a combination of things across the board, and it's not always just the temperatures rising, and it's, you know, pathogens, nitrogen, and also as these things change, the species that we're used to probably will move or change their migration patterns.
Great, thanks, Matt. Steve, we touched a little bit about sea level rise and storm impacts. Are there concerns about longevity of living shoreline designs? And you know, how can they be maintained long term?
So there definitely has been some issues. We've had issues at Widow's Hole. Anyone who's been down the site has noticed that we had no sooner gotten in, you know, finished the project, and we're faced with a really heavy storm and winter, and the dune has definitely taken a beating at that site. Again, dunes tend to be a bit sacrificial, but again, we're kind of trying to catch up with that. When we were starting to plan, when we were looking at things like fetch and wave exposure and wave energy at sites, we're looking at older data and you know, looking at older wind data and weather patterns and things like that. Things have drastically changed in a very short time. We're seeing many more wind events, more severity of these storms. Anyone who lives on the water over the last, I would say, 5 years has noticed the really the super high tides that we have that accompany these storms, which causes issues. And when you're planning a living shoreline, you're going to need to factor that in. And in a lot of cases, the permitting organizations, the regulatory agencies are good at helping in their regulatory process, someone applying for these projects to consider how they may build in some resiliency for longevity into these projects, increasing the grade, the percent grades in spots, increasing the size of the materials you're going to use so that they're less likely to be carried away. So instead of using a cobble band at Widow's Hole to help protect the toe or the base edge of the Spartino, which we had initially installed, there was a recommendation from New York State DEC that we include as an adaptive management, adding having the possibility of putting boulders in as a better wave break. And that is something that we found that we definitely need that now that this project is moving on. So that's something we'll be able to move into. It is one of those things that you really need to be mindful and think about how to project the survivability of your project into the future. And, you know, it is difficult to tell how fast climate conditions are going to change, but there are ways of building this in, and there's guides available and resources available that help the planning process to do this. So.
Great. So Elizabeth, are living shorelines an effective technique for mitigation and increasing resiliency?
Yeah, so, you know, living shorelines have been widely cited as a tool that can be used to help mitigate the effects of climate change and increase resilience. It's not the only tool in the toolbox, and it may not be appropriate, you know, in all situations. For instance, in shorelines with high wave energy, living shorelines may not work. But in environments and shorelines where we have low to moderate wave energy, these projects, as we've discussed here, can help prevent shoreline erosion. There can be, issues, as Steve alluded to. You got to make sure that you design the project for the conditions at your shoreline and think about the future and the maintenance of that project over time. But, if we get it right, they can certainly have some benefits. And unlike bulkheads and seawalls, the great thing about living shorelines is that they will typically allow for the natural landward migration of our shorelines, which is really necessitated by rising sea levels. So if you have a bulkhead or seawall there's nowhere for the shoreline to migrate, and that habitat is just going to be eventually lost completely. I do think living shorelines in some cases can help us preserve our beaches and coastal habitats so that wildlife and people can continue to use these into the future.
Great, thanks. So speaking of the future, Matt, does the Peconic Land Trust have any additional plans for Widow's Hole or any of your other properties?
Yeah, so we're kind of in this environment where we're trying a lot of things out with what we've done on phase 1. So we're going to continue to, figure this thing out and also maintain phase 1, we call it, of the plan. It's because we have several phases, but we're also going to expand this into phase 2. We're currently in a situation where we're looking for some funding, and Peconic Estuary Partnership is really been on board and trying to help us with that. We're reaching out to the local community as well for funding. On other projects, we recently in East Hampton acquired the old Il Molino restaurant site, and we're doing a full restoration project there along the shoreline of Georgica Pond. We're doing a very unique restoration in Mastic Beach on the Forge River. That's like a floodplain restoration where the goal is to bring on a heavy amount of water onto the property during storm events to be some sacrificial to other residential areas, and then drain that water off quickly once the storm event is over. So we're working on a number of different things, but the living shoreline is a very new thing. So we're Steve and I are just going to keep collecting data and turning that into the DEC, and hopefully we get better and better at this thing.
Great. Yeah, that sounds great. Steve, what about at CCE? Do you guys have plans for other living shorelines around the bay? I know you talked about Widow's Hole and the Shinnecock and your demonstration sites already.
Well, we're definitely looking forward. We've already have the plans drawn up, the design plans for the phase 2 at Widow's Hole, which would be dealing with the section just to the north of the current project area, basically the point that goes between Greenport Harbor and the Widow's Hole Inlet, and we've actually learned, lessons from the first phase that we've already modified that plan to accommodate and include some upgrades in our thinking to help better protect the shoreline. We do have some proposals in to do more work at the Shinnecock Nation. The first phase of the project there, which was completed in 2017, really it's 3,000 feet of shoreline. We did there was 35,000 cubic yards of sand placed, so it's a different scale to what we're really talking about, but due to the special nature of the Shinnecock Nation, and there's more we can do there without the need to permit. We're mindful of doing things that aren't that will negatively impact the environment, but it gives us a little more to play with. It's been a really great learning tool, and it's been very successful so far, so we're looking forward to that. You and I, not just in the Peconics, but you and I and Elizabeth, the Peconic Estuary Partnership, have been advising homeowners associations all around the island. CCE works with homeowners and residents throughout Suffolk County. So we've been working with a group in Lindenhurst, in Mattituck, and I field a lot of calls from people who are definitely interested. So I expect to see a lot more projects in the future.
Thanks, Steve. And to add to that list, I got a call from North Shore, Nassau County this afternoon. So it's definitely of interest. And speaking of interest, Elizabeth, I know that everybody's already asking this from the chat, but so where can people go to learn more about these living shorelines, and who can they contact for information?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good resources out there, and I think we have a slide with a list compiled for you guys to make it easy, and I can also try to put some of the links in the chat in a few minutes here. But if you want to learn more about the Widow's Hole project that we were discussing a lot about, Peconic Land Trust has developed a great story map, and there's also a really nice video about this project. So I would certainly encourage you to check that out. On the Peconic Estuary Partnership website, we have a page about a demonstration project that we are funding that Steve mentioned at the Suffolk County Marine Environmental Learning Center. It talks about that project as well as just general benefits of living shorelines. We also have a lot of information on our website about climate change and climate adaptation strategies in general that may be of interest. The systems approach to geomorphic engineering listed. This is a community of practice that is promoting living shorelines, and they have a lot of great information on their site that you might want to check out. And then, as I think I mentioned earlier, the DEC has a living shoreline guidance document that should definitely be checked out by anyone interested in installing one of these living shorelines. And the state also recently released another guidance document using natural measures to reduce the risk of flooding that could be helpful as well. And then NOAA has some great information on their site as well about living shorelines. And I'm sure there's a lot more resources out there, and I'll try to throw some of these links in the chat as well. And if you guys have more questions after we finish up here, or if you're interested in getting started with the Living Shoreline Project but don't know how to begin, I would encourage you to reach out to any of the panelists here tonight or to Kathleen. We can help you, hopefully help you get started and answer any questions you have.
Great. Thanks so much. And here's the slide with all of our contact information. Again, feel free to reach out to any or all of us. I'd want to ask the panelists just quickly, I've run through all of my questions for you guys. If there's anything else you would like to add before we start going through the questions that have come from the attendees.
I'll just say thanks to Peconic Land Trust for putting on this great panel discussion and for inviting the Peconic Estuary Partnership and myself to participate.
Absolutely, I second that.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Land Trust. They've been a great partner in this project. They've really helped us learn a lot. And I'd also like to just say that not all shorelines are going to be, a living shoreline is not going to fit all shorelines. So there's a lot of things that play in. We actually have a graphic that's from NOAA's Habitat Blueprint site that kind of gives you an idea with how much wave exposure and how much wave energy a site gets, where you would be in the spectrum of green shorelines versus what they call gray shorelines, which would be your hardened shorelines. Where, of course, if you're on Long Island Sound, say at Orient Point, and with a northeast fetch of Connecticut, you would not be a good site for a living shoreline. The wave energy is just too high in that case. So, it's not always going to fit. But if we can, you know, work it into areas that it is a good fit for, it definitely is an option that we would love to see more people using.
Great. I'm seeing here a question from Mike Bilecki. Hi, Mike. Is this project in an area that would be considered moderate to high energy wave environments or low energy wave environments? He is wondering if there was a need to build offshore protections like breakwaters and sills. And if these are needed, is it really a living shoreline?
So I would say that it was originally, when we were planning this, it was a low, moderate to moderate shoreline, and would probably still be moderate to a little bit higher, but not a high energy shoreline where we should only be doing, you know, rock revetments, breakwaters. Now, part of the living shoreline philosophy, and especially if you go down south, they do use offshore structures, typically some kind of reef, mostly oyster reefs, but other options to help as a wave break. So you could have, and they're still considered living shorelines. So you could still have those kind of structures available. The only reason that we don't include, say, like an offshore oyster reef or something, we did it at Shinnecock because it's a very regulated area. The Shinnecocks are very protective of their grounds and their lands, so they're good at watching this. But if we were to place, say, offshore oyster reefs to act as wave break in an area where the DEC has closed the area to shellfishing, and so those oyster reefs become potentially an attractive nuisance to people that want to harvest, and they're harvesting from uncertified waters, that becomes an issue because they eat clams from uncertified waters, or oysters from uncertified waters get sick, and now there's a lawsuit for whoever put those oyster reefs out there potentially. So offshore structures are definitely considered in universally in the philosophy of a living shoreline, as long as it's some kind of a living structure. And or living habitat. So seagrasses planted offshore as part of a living shoreline would be considered part of that as well. But again, as I said, a high energy wave site would not be suitable in most cases for a living shoreline.
Thanks, Steve. Matt, I think you're probably best to answer this question. Can you talk a little bit more about the future plans for the Forge River site?
Yeah, actually, that does have quite a few components of a living shoreline in there. That is still in the permit process, but we're very close to that. What we're doing is, there was a home on the site, and we actually demolished the home, and there was a lot of underground tanks. We removed those, and there was also a significant amount of bulkheading on the property, which was also removed. But we did maintain a section of that because, as Steve was saying, it was a high energy area. So really, we felt it was best, it was there, not to remove it because it was pre-existing. But we're building up one area with kind of a dune and some spartina and beach grass plantings. And then some of the lower areas are actually gonna take some trenching to kind of fill in some water during storm events and then move that off of there. But if anybody, whoever's asking this question, I'm more than willing to send you our engineer drawings or plans on that if you want to email me.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Elizabeth, I'm going to pose this question to you, but Matt and Steve jump in. Are there opportunities or places where volunteers can help collect data?
Yeah, I think we've tried to get the community involved in some of these projects. So I think, I don't know how much at the moment we have volunteers helping us with the monitoring, but I think there's definitely going to be opportunities in the future to do that. So maybe Steve wants to talk more about some of that monitoring, and he could jump in there. And I think also, you know, there's a state effort as well to do some shoreline monitoring, and maybe that's something that eventually volunteers will be able to participate in as well.
Yeah, we've actually utilized students from Stony Brook. We had an ecology class come out and help us do vegetative counts out on the Shinnecock project that we worked on. And, you know, I would be more than happy to, you know, have some help from people at Widow's Hole. You know, the monitoring part is the easy part. It's the planting is where we always need the hands, but we'd always welcome people to come out and get their hands dirty counting, you know, shoots of Spartina, shoots of beach grass, and doing some of the other measurements that we take on these sites. And there'll be more need as we have more of these projects that come up. Typically, the regulatory agencies require some kind of monitoring and maintenance period for these types of projects. So for, you know, once more residential projects pop up, the homeowners are going to need to be able to do these types of monitoring and maintenance themselves. And I'm assuming we'll, you know, Cornell will be there to help advise and show people how to do it. But yes, you could definitely get in touch with me if you're interested in getting involved. And when we have projects coming up, we can see if we can accommodate people.
Great. Matt, were you going to add?
Yeah, you'll see if you guys look at the end of the story map, there's a few videos in there. Most of the stuff we did besides the major bulldozer work and stuff down there at Widow's Hole, we used volunteers, and we're actually partnered up with Greenport Schools. So you can see all of that within the videos.
That's great. Steve, here's a plant question for you. What species of plants for living shorelines would you recommend in brackish situations such as at Georgica Pond or Mecox Bay?
So we've done some work around Sag Pond when I first started with Cornell with Chris Pickrell, and there is Spartina growing in there, and Spartina will tolerate brackish water. The problem you get with doing any kind of plantings is you wind up, especially in those ponds, they have a high populations or large populations of Phragmites, common reed, which is an invasive, and that plant spreads when there's a disturbance typically. So in a disturbed area where you would be wanting to plant Spartina or some of the other plants, there's a list I could give you that are brackish tolerant. But you really need to be careful with managing and maintaining that area and keeping the Phragmites out, because once it gets a foothold in a brackish system, it's a much better competitor than the Spartina would be. Whereas in a fully marine environment, the Spartina is definitely always going to outcompete the Phragmites in a fully intertidal marine. But that's something that you have my contact information. I can provide you with a list of plants based on what you're looking to do.
Great. Thanks. Here's a great question. Does anyone need permission to implement a living shoreline at a private creekfront residence? And how about for hardened options in the same regards, you know, at a private, what permission do you need to get?
I don't know if Elizabeth wants to, but typically any kind of wetland, and Elizabeth, you could chime in because this is your area as well, but you're going to need permits from all levels, but Elizabeth can speak especially to the state.
Yeah, you're definitely going to need a permit from the state for sure, for either a living shoreline or a hardened shoreline structure. So that guidance document I mentioned before that the state put out, that's specifically to help guide the permitting process if you're interested in doing a living shoreline project. So you are going to need to have plans for whatever type of project you're doing, and you'll have to submit those to the DEC and submit a formal permit application to get those approved. And I know there's also, you know, other permits you're going to have to get as well sometimes. Local permits, the Army Corps. Steve and Matt had a really fun time, I think, with Widow's Hole trying to track down all the permits. So they can tell you a little bit more about that process, but try to sound positive, guys, so you don't scare anyone off.
The permitting process is just a typical process. So for New York State, there's a joint wetlands application that encompasses both federal with the Army Corps of Engineers, the New York State Department of State for Coastal Management Practices, New York State DEC. It depends on if you have underwater lands, then it would be Office of General Services as well. And then of course, your local towns and villages also have their own permitting processes. Everybody is, the joint permit kind of ties the major big players together. You would set that permit out. It's not terrible. Now that, you know, New York State has developed this living shoreline guidance, their regulatory agent arm is getting more used to doing a living shoreline type restoration versus just bulkheads and hard shores. So it that changes a little thing, changes the process a little bit. Army Corps has their wetland restoration and tidal wetland restoration nationwide permit process that most of these living shorelines in a residential would be part of. It's a much easier process to go through than having to do a full individual permit with Army Corps. And then and then working, honestly, I think the biggest thing is to contact your regulatory agencies when you're interested in doing a project, even before you get too in depth in your planning, and set up a pre-application meeting with them and say, this is what we want to do. How does it look to you? And what's the best way of going about this so that we can get a permitted project through your regulatory agencies? And they're very helpful. They want you to do the best job you can. They want it to be a good project. And that'll make if you do that pre-application meeting, that really will make your experience a lot better working with the regulatory agencies. But I will tell you, plan on at least a year ahead of time for your permits. It can go faster than that. It could go longer than that. It depends. But when you're figuring out your timeline, plan a year to get your permits in place.
Yeah. I'll second what Steve said about setting up that pre-application meeting. I was thinking the exact same thing. I really think that's a good idea. And if there are folks out there interested in living shoreline projects, I do work. I'm not in the permitting office, but I have worked with the permitting folks. So you can also reach out to me, and I can get you in touch with the appropriate people.
We had two follow-ups come in as you guys were discussing that to this question. The first one would be oyster reefs. Would that also require a permit? And the second one is, if you do build a living shoreline, where can you get the plants?
I am not a shellfish scientist or biologist. I do work with a shellfish expert at Cornell, Greg Rivara. He does do oyster reefs, and yes, they do require a permit offshore. Again, that's a similar process to this. It's Army Corps, it's DEC, Department of State, OGS, and then the local towns and villages, depending on jurisdiction they have in the waters. So In the Peconics, typically it's more state, although depending on what water body in the individual towns you are, you would likely require trustee permits as well. And then in the South Shore Estuary, because a lot of this has been going on with oyster farming and things, the individual towns have more of a say and more into the regulatory aspects down there. So that's just from experience and what I've learned from a colleague. But they are permittable, but you do have to get a permit. You just, being that they're a good thing doesn't mean you could just put them out there.
Yeah, I'll just add that there are a number of very good and experienced permit expediters on Long Island that could answer a lot of your questions. But if you ever want to call any of us, if you're really considering any of this, please do that. And then in addition, if you're required to do any engineer drawings, all of the engineering firms I've worked with do offer the permitting as a service. If you want to go that route, it depends on how much time you have.
Yeah, that's a good point, Matt. And sorry, Kathleen, I'll just jump in and say too, I think definitely reach out to us, and we could also provide, I think, a list of contractors and people that do this type of stuff for the engineering, design, and permitting. I think all of us have some connections and know the right folks to get you in touch with.
So here's the $100 million question. Are there any available grants to support living shoreline installations?
Yes, there are. Grants are hard to get. I think Matt and Steve have been trying to apply for grants for Widow's Hole Phase 2. Not successful yet, but we are still trying. But there are some grants out there, federal grants, state grants. The state has a Climate Smart Communities grant. That is an option if you're a town or a village interested in doing, a living shoreline project or any type of climate adaptation project. Yeah, and I don't know, Matt and Steve maybe can chime in with some other experiences.
Well, I would say from my experience, look into state, local, and, anything else like, Ducks Unlimited, all that type of stuff would have grants. There are federal grants, but I'm telling you, they're just extremely competitive. And I feel like whenever we send one in, they just laugh at us because they're looking at these huge projects, like moving a dam or something like that. It's like, we're not even on their radar when we submit. So I would imagine it would be the same thing for a homeowner. So the closer, to local you can get with the grants, the better off you're going to be.
Kathleen may be able to speak to this. I haven't seen one in a while, but New York State had a coastal erosion program at one point where they had small grants for homeowners to do. At the time, it was more work on bluffs and along the North Shore of Long Island and other places that had erosion issues. But with the advent and the acceptance of these living shorelines in New York, if that program ever comes back around or something similar, I would think that any kind of living shoreline, even if it's not in a high energy erosion area, may be eligible for those grants. So with grants, again, they're very cyclical, they're very competitive. And it's one of those things that, we actually, most organizations have people that's all they do is look for grants. So it takes a little work, especially on the homeowner side. You're usually only a few person team to find these things, but you could have some persistence. You contact our different agencies. We've advised different homeowners groups, and contact us periodically. We may have heard something. We get emails from things that don't apply to us, but we may be able to pass on to someone else.
Yeah, definitely. Here's a question. How labor intensive is this type of project? How labor intensive is building a living shoreline?
I don't know, Matt, what do you think?
The actual construction of the shoreline goes pretty smoothly. The very intensive part is the permitting, and then the construction, if you have a good marine contractor, we use a number of local contractors, marine contractors, sand and gravel operators, and that all goes pretty smooth as long as you have the plan in hand. I think the intensive part is just the permitting and kind of keeping up with the maintenance when you need it. But you have to do that also with hardened shorelines, as everybody knows.
So I said this last night in our meeting with the group from Lindenhurst that honestly, the hardest part of these projects for me is the planning and the permitting. Once you get to the construction phase, it's almost like a sigh of relief. But it really depends on the project. So so a back creek area with low energy where you would use core logs to stabilize your bank and then revegetate, that's definitely something that a homeowner could do without a marine contractor. You could buy the core logs through Home Depot, Lowe's, or any other wholesaler, retailer, and you can a lot of the local there's several local nurseries and plant growing organizations that can provide Spartina or other plants that you may need. And then, of course, they're most definitely they're commercially available from big wholesale nurseries that are up and down the East Coast. Typically, I like to keep local if we can. This way, we're not bringing in any kind of weird genetics. So for Cornell's projects and for the projects we did at Widow's Hole, we actually harvested seed from the site there. There's existing Spartina, and there was also existing beach grass that we were able to propagate from a very few plants and a very limited seed source. And we grew basically all the plants that we needed for the project. And we've done that for other projects as well. So, and that's something that Cornell I can provide instruction on how to do that. It's not that difficult to do, but.
There was a request to discuss, to hear a little bit more about maintenance of living shorelines and monitoring, the monitoring related to the permit conditions or just overall need for monitoring.
So typically monitoring, it really depends on the project. So I've had projects where we were required to monitor for 5 years. I've also heard of projects, either wetland projects, not necessarily living shoreline because we haven't had a lot of them, but where it's you have to ensure that the plants survive for at least through 2 seasons. And then after that, you're kind of off the hook, which that's not you shouldn't give up on your project after 2 years because you've got that time invested in it and it's easy enough to help maintain. So it really depends on what the permits require, and that's going to be an individual basis with the regulators determining that, working with the applicant. Really that's survival. So if you put in 100 plants in a small area, they're going to want a percentage of those plants to survive after 2 years. It really depends on the scale of the project and what the regulatory agency is going to require.
Thanks, Steve. So I've been fielding these Q&A and chats, and I've been kind of picking through to find all of the living shorelines ones. It looks like we've gone through pretty much all of them at this point, but there have been some other questions related to other issues around the Peconic Bay. So I'm going to kind of go into some of those. The first one being, are there any programs to remediate wetland ditching on private wetlands? I'm not sure who would be best to speak to that.
Well, so, the Peconic Estuary Partnership, we do a lot of habitat restoration projects, including wetland restoration, We do often work on, public lands, state and town-owned lands, but we can and work with private property owners as well if they're willing to work with us and interested in that.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling to find the other question I was looking for. Here it is. Can we shift focus for a second to the bluffs on the North Shore and kind of quickly talk about some of the least impactful solutions to the erosion that is occurring on the bluffs?
I think that's Kathleen's bailiwick, so you get to feel that one.
Yeah, I don't work on the North Shore, so.
Yes, to answer that question, I'll take it. There are natural ways to deal with erosion on the bluffs, and again, to not take up too much time, I'd be happy to have a conversation with anybody who is interested in learning more about bluff erosion and mitigation options. But there are natural methods to reduce the erosion that's occurring on the bluffs. Okay, there was a question about, here it is, water quality and how specifically related to golf courses. I'm not sure if there's somebody who could talk about that.
Well, I can tell you that every golf course is managed a little bit differently. Most of the golf course managers that we've dealt with pride themselves on trying to use as little nitrogen and chemicals as they can, although they do have to use some. But the only thing I'll say is it can be a problem if it's not managed correctly. But generally, they're not trying to dump as much as they can on the golf course because of both the expense of it, and most golf courses are becoming more and more environmentally sound, but still much more than, I would say, a traditionally managed lawn. Although on the North and South Fork of Long Island, we have the greenest lawns anywhere in the world. So it's a thing that we all have to pay attention to. And I don't know what will ever happen as far as regulations, but the main thing is just educating the public on you don't have to dump 1,000 pounds of nitrogen on your lawn, because everything there ends up in our estuary. And if you like to eat fish and go out boating, then you should be have that in your conscience.
Yeah, I'll follow up on Matt a little bit. We do a lot of water quality stuff, and yes, there's a lot of different sources of pollutants that can cause the addition of nitrogen to our bays, and that leads to not the best water quality and a lot of harmful algal blooms, as Matt I think talked about earlier. And relating it back to living shorelines a little. Living shorelines and our natural wetland habitats, they can help filter out some of those pollutants. And so that's another great benefit of our natural wetlands and living shoreline habitats.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there are they are coming up with these new technologies to help reduce nitrogen, moving from groundwater into different water bodies as well. I know Ron Paulson from Cornell actually specializes in this. He'll study groundwater and where nitrogen's coming from, and he's done a number of studies over the years, including the installation of permeable reactive barriers and things like this to kind of create a wall so the nitrogen can't pass through it. And a lot of that's uses natural techniques like wood chips and things like this. So that's another very interesting thing that's going on in the space.
There was a comment made about pressure equalizer modules combating beach erosion and passive dewatering systems. Yes, I do know about the project you're referencing, and if that person is still on the line and has more questions about it, I'd be happy to just touch base with you to discuss your questions or concerns. And then I think I've been doing a good job of trying to get all of these questions. Kathy, maybe you can check to make sure I've answered everything. I'm going, while I answer this last one about the need for sand, and panelists feel free to jump in about beach nourishment and the is there a need for sand? Is it really in short supply? And where do we get it for beach nourishment projects? Or I'll take the question. So, you know, erosion, beach erosion, it does kind of occur on a cyclical basis. So especially here on the South Shore, we see beaches become more narrow in the winter and accrete in the summer. But there are large erosion events where sand is essentially permanently moved out of the system. And most of the sand that nourishes our South Shore beaches actually comes from offshore. And they dredge and pump it up onto the beach. Again, happy to talk about that in further detail with anybody at another time.
Kathleen, there was a question about the possibility of sea kelp being used to help support the work that's being done. If anyone wants to jump in on that question.
Being that I think I'm the only seaweed person on the panel, I have actually been working with kelp aquaculture. We did some feasibility project back in 2017 in the Peconics that was funded by county water quality protection money. And then I've been currently working on a project with Lazy Point Farms that's situated throughout Long Island, growers situated throughout Long Island. The interesting thing, so kelp is really a winter species for us. I don't know if the individual asking the question is talking about the possibility of putting the kelp out as a wave baffles and wave dampening structure. Typically, kelp is not going to be permitted that close to shore, being that on Long Island, currently it's regulated as an aquaculture activity. And most of our sites, except in the South Shore Estuary, where the towns are in more control of what gets done in their waters, but in the Peconics, it probably wouldn't be useful, being that they would have to be at least 1,000 feet offshore. So, and at that point, that really their impact on wave action coming into the shore wouldn't be helpful. But in the South Shore estuaries, where the local municipalities have a little more control, they potentially could be placed close enough in the wintertime that waves coming into shore would have to pass through the long lines with the kelp, and that would dampen wave energy. The other option would be offshore. We were talking about whether offshore structures would be incorporated. Even seaweed, not necessarily kelp in this case, but intertidal rockweeds, which is another brown seaweed growing on the boulders in the intertidal zone. Just their presence on those rocks also help to, as the waves swirl around the rocks, to deaden some of the wave energy. So, but again, that's more of a natural colonization and something that would happen over time anyway. But hopefully that answers the question.
There was another question for you, Steve, about whether the town of Southampton is using any of your advice to help rebuild the beaches on the South Shore.
We are not directly involved. We've been helping the town with individual projects at small scale sites. So the issue that happened at near the Shinnecock Inlet, was that 2 years ago now? Was that 20? Yeah, it was 2019. That the scale of that is way beyond something that I would be and Cornell would be equipped to handle. And being that I believe the Army Corps really took that over, they have their own specialists that know how to do this. And that was led, I believe, on the federal level. We do have our Tiana Bay education facility at Tiana on the Tiana Bay side facility. We're actually starting with funds from CPF money from Southampton. We're going to increase the size of our native plant nursery, which is used for shoreline restoration work on town lands. And hopefully we're going to be doing some more projects with the town. So we are working with the town, but just not on those large scale, major projects that really require Army Corps to be involved. We don't have that kind of manpower.
It sounds like something like that might be useful to get volunteers involved. Do you use volunteers at the Marine Center in East Quogue? At Tiana?
We will be. We've held volunteer events, so volunteers were involved in the initial establishment of the native plant nursery. We've also done this year, even with COVID, we managed to hold 2 eelgrass events in Southampton town, where our Marine Meadows events, where volunteers help us weave eelgrass into our burlap discs, and then our divers plant them out. And the restoration site for those plants this year was actually just offshore of the Tiana Bayside facility in Tiana Bay. So, that again, the presence of seagrass offshore helps to protect the shoreline as well as wave dampening, as well as habitat. So, but keep an eye on our websites. If you sign up, you can get volunteer bulletins, and we also do use people. Although with COVID, it has been kind of tricky, but with our planting, growing our Spartina and our other nursery plants as well. So.
Is it time to wrap up, Kathleen? Are we full on those questions? I think we've gone through most.
Let's see, one comment just came in from Southampton. Town trustees have permitted several residential living shorelines and would welcome more applications. Good, so that's good to know for anybody in Southampton town. Other than that, I think I've pretty much gone through all of the questions I saw. Thanks.
Did we answer the question about the remediating wetland ditching? Was that addressed? I don't remember.
I think we touched on that. I think the question, right, was about, whether we work on private property, which, we can do if there's interested.
Ducks Unlimited
folks.
has a program for that. I just wanted to touch on, I thought I saw that. I guess I missed somehow, but I may have been typing a response to something else. But yeah, Ducks Unlimited has funded and actually helped supply the materials and the know-how for getting those kind of projects permitted and done. So I would definitely look into that. They definitely do work on private lands.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I guess if there's anything else any of the panelists want to add, otherwise, I guess I want to thank everybody for sticking with us and attending the webinar. And thank you again to the Peconic Land Trust for hosting it. And Kathy, I don't know if you have any closing remarks.
Yeah, I definitely want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today and being a part of it and offering your wonderful expertise to our audience. Very, very good, engaging conversation about living shorelines. So thank you all, and Kathleen, thank you for moderating for us. I also want to mention that this will be a recording of the video, be available on our blog very soon. So if you're interested in following up with the conversation, with some of the information that was on the slides. It'll be on our blog, which is on our website. So you can check that out. And you'll notice also when you visit the blog that there are a lot of other programs that we've kept up there. If you've missed some of those and are interested in checking those out, definitely do so while you're there and visiting. And I hope you enjoy them. So thank you very much for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.